It was supposed to save Case, a bold new diesel engine built to pull bigger loads, run longer hours, and push Case back to the top of the horsepower wars. On paper, it looked like the future, a rugged powerhouse ready to take on anything the fields could throw at it. But out in the real world, under real pressure, the 504 diesel started showing cracks, and what began as Case's greatest hope quickly turned into one of the biggest mechanical disasters in the company's history. This is the 504 diesel disaster story, the engine that nearly broke Case. By the late 1960s, the race for horsepower was leaving no one untouched, and Case was feeling the pressure more than most. For years, Case had built its reputation on simple, durable tractors that could outwork almost anything else in the field. But the world was changing. Deere was rising fast with their new Generation 2 tractors. International Harvester was still strong in the Midwest, and smaller companies like Versatile and Steiger were pushing into new high-horsepower territory, carving away customers who needed more muscle to work bigger farms. Fields were getting larger, implements were getting heavier. Farmers were no longer satisfied with 80 or 90 horsepower. They needed 110, 130, and even pushing 150 horses at the drawbar just to keep pace with modern tillage equipment. Case's existing tractors, even tough models like the 1030, were quickly starting to look outmatched. Farmers wanted more pulling power, more speed, and engines that could take endless hard hours without flinching. Inside Case headquarters, the message was clear. If they didn't innovate, and fast, they were going to lose not just market share, but their place in the farming world altogether. The company's solution was ambitious. Case would launch an entirely new generation of tractors, the 70 series. Bigger, sleeker, and more powerful than anything Case had offered before. And at the heart of these machines would be a brand new diesel engine, one that would deliver more torque, more durability, and more working hours than anything else they had ever built. It would be called the 504. On paper, it looked like the perfect answer to Case's problems. But paper doesn't pull a plow, and Case was about to find that out the hard way. When Case set out to build a new diesel engine for their 70 series tractors, they knew they couldn't just tweak an old design. Farmers wanted real power, and Case needed something that would deliver it without compromise. The result was the 504 cubic inch diesel, a big straight-six workhorse designed from the ground up. With a bore of 4.625 inches and a stroke of 5 inches, the 504 had the size and breathing room to make serious torque at low RPMs. In turbocharged versions, it could push well over 150 horsepower, giving Case a fighting chance against Deere's increasingly powerful lineup and IH's 66 series machines. One of the major selling points was the 504's mid-sleeve block design. Instead of traditional wet sleeves that fully separated the cylinder from the block, the 504 used partial sleeves that bonded with the block material. Traditional wet sleeves were known for great cooling, but sometimes struggled with sealing issues at the top and bottom. The 504's mid-sleeve approach aimed to solve that, offering good cooling contact while strengthening the block by partially bonding the sleeve into the casting. In theory, it would reduce distortion under heavy loads and help the engine run cooler and more efficiently. Case engineers also focused on making the 504 easy to service. The engine used a simple mechanical injection system, heavy-duty internals, and a straightforward turbocharger setup on most models. Farmers and independent mechanics wouldn't need exotic tools or specialized knowledge to keep them running. In an era when downtime could make or break a farm season, that kind of practicality mattered. The 504 wasn't just going into one tractor either. Case planned to make it the heart of their new 70 series lineup, from the 970 right up to the 1270. It was the centerpiece of their comeback plan, and marketing materials promised farmers a bold new era of power, reliability, and efficiency. On the dyno, it looked like they had built exactly what the market demanded. But dynos don't pull plows either, and the fields of North America were about to put the 504 to a much harder test. At first glance, the Case 504 diesel didn't seem all that unusual. It was a big inline-six built for torque with the turbocharger bolted on for the higher horsepower models. But under the surface, it was playing by a different set of rules, and farmers noticed. One major innovation was the mid-sleeve block design. Instead of using traditional wet sleeves that fully separated the cylinder from the surrounding block material, the 504 bonded partial sleeves directly into the casting. In theory, this allowed better heat transfer, potentially helping the engine manage temperatures more effectively under load. Case engineers hoped this would translate into longer life and more stable performance during heavy work. Another selling point was the simple, heavy-duty mechanical fuel system. The 504 used direct injection with relatively few moving parts, avoiding the complexity of some of the high-pressure systems competitors were starting to experiment with. This kept the engine easy to repair with basic tools, something Case heavily marketed to independent farmers and small-town shops who didn't want to chase proprietary parts. Another area Case engineers focused on was the torque curve. The 504 was designed to deliver strong, usable torque across a broad RPM range, aiming to give farmers steady pulling power without needing constant gear changes during tillage or planting. Paired with Case's powershift transmission, the 504 offered one of the smoothest working setups of its time. Operators could shift on the go under heavy load without worrying about clutch slippage or lost momentum. In an era when every minute in the field counted, that seamless pull-through power was a major selling point. On paper, Case looked like they had finally built a diesel engine that could take on Deere, IH, and the new wave of high-horsepower competition. The 70 series tractors were sleek, powerful, and packed with features that farmers had been asking for. But while the engineering sounded good in the showroom, it would be the brutal, unforgiving fields of North America that would reveal the real story. The 504 looked good on the dyno, it looked good in the brochures, but once farmers started putting it to work, the cracks, literal and figurative, began to show. The first big issue was head gasket failures. Under heavy loads and long working hours, the 504 engines developed serious sealing problems between the block and head. Coolant leaks weren't just an annoyance, they could quickly escalate into overheated engines, warped heads, and catastrophic internal damage. In some cases, farmers barely got a few seasons out of a brand new tractor before facing a full teardown. Then there was the mid-sleeve block itself. In theory, it was supposed to make the engine stronger. In practice, it made the block extremely sensitive to coolant management. If coolant chemistry wasn't maintained perfectly, the sleeves became vulnerable to cavitation erosion. Tiny vapor bubbles would form against the cylinder walls under heavy load, collapse violently, and slowly eat away the metal from the inside out. Left unchecked, this silent destruction could punch holes straight through the cylinder walls, killing an engine that otherwise looked fine from the outside. Farmers who were used to the relatively forgiving wet sleeve engines from Deere or IH were caught off guard. In those designs, a failed sleeve was bad, but usually replaceable. In the Case 504, cavitation often meant block destruction. No simple fix, no quick patch, a ruined block meant either a total engine replacement or a costly and time-consuming rebuild that sometimes didn't even guarantee long-term survival. The oiling system didn't help either. While adequate for moderate loads, the stock oiling pathways in the 504 could struggle under extreme field conditions, especially with turbocharged models pulling hard for hours at a time. Bearings, cam lobes, and rocker arms sometimes wore prematurely, leading to unexpected failures long before the tractor itself showed any visible signs of fatigue. Meanwhile, the powershift transmission, one of Case's biggest selling points, was designed to reduce drivetrain stress by allowing smooth, on-the-go gear changes without breaking traction or hammering the clutch. But like any system, it still relied on proper technique. Operators who ran full throttle through shifts under heavy load could put serious strain on the engine. Without good RPM management and regular maintenance, even a strong 504 could be worn down ahead of its time. For Case, it was a nightmare. They had bet the future of the 70 series on an engine that, while innovative on paper, simply wasn't rugged enough in real-world farming conditions. Warranty claims climbed, reputation damage spread, and once the stories of cracked blocks and ruined heads started making the rounds at coffee shops and farm auctions, it became harder and harder to sell farmers on a bold new era that seemed to come with a ticking clock. The 504 wasn't a bad design by intention. It was ambitious, but in the fields of North America, ambition wasn't enough. Despite its problems, the Case 504 diesel wasn't a lost cause, at least not for farmers willing to fight for it. Across the Midwest, farmers and mechanics found ways to stretch more life out of the engine, even if it meant working around some of its biggest weaknesses. One of the first upgrades was addressing the cavitation issue. Farmers who understood the risks started paying closer attention to coolant maintenance. Special additives known as supplemental coolant additives, SCAs, were used to protect the inside surfaces of the block. Mechanics recommended aggressive coolant replacement schedules, and some farmers even installed aftermarket coolant filters to better manage the chemistry over time. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it helped slow the invisible erosion that had destroyed so many 504 blocks. Head gasket problems were tackled with a mix of upgraded parts and careful installation practices. Some aftermarket suppliers began offering improved gasket materials that resisted heat cycling better than the originals. Experienced mechanics learned to check deck flatness and retorque the heads more carefully during rebuilds, minimizing the chance of early failure. It wasn't uncommon for rebuilt 504s to outlast the originals by thousands of hours, if the work was done right. Oil system concerns were also partially addressed. Farmers began using higher quality oils, sometimes switching to formulations better suited to heavy turbocharged diesel engines. Some repair shops modified oil delivery pathways slightly during overhauls, improving bearing lubrication and reducing top-end wear on engines working under constant heavy load. And then there were the practical habits, the things no spec sheet ever taught. Farmers learned to idle the engines down properly before shutting off to protect turbos. They learned to avoid low RPM lugging under load, keeping oil pressure and cooling flow strong. They watched coolant levels religiously, and they stopped viewing minor leaks as just a nuisance. None of these fixes made the 504 indestructible, but they made it survivable. And for many farms running on tight budgets, survivable was good enough. In a strange way, the 504 earned a second life through the stubbornness of the farmers who refused to give up on it. It wasn't the perfect diesel Case had promised, but in the hands of operators who knew its weaknesses and worked around them, it could still earn its place pulling hard across the fields. By the early 1970s, Case knew it had a serious problem on its hands. Farmers were frustrated, warranty claims were piling up, and the 504's reputation was taking a beating across farm country. Case engineers scrambled to patch the engine's most obvious weaknesses. They introduced revised head gasket materials, hoping tougher designs would stop the constant failures. They issued updated torque specifications, insisting that proper tightening could prevent cracks and leaks. Some 504s even received updated water pumps, trying to improve the cooling system's margin. But none of these fixes addressed the root problem. The 504's basic design simply wasn't built to handle the real-world punishment farmers gave it. Worse, Case dragged its feet on fully admitting how bad the situation was. Rather than issuing a broad recall, they handled each failure quietly on a case-by-case basis, often leaving it up to individual dealers to smooth things over. Case did issue some service bulletins aimed at improving reliability, like updated torque specs, revised gasket materials, and coolant system recommendations, but there was no coordinated public campaign. Most of these updates trickled out quietly through dealer channels, which only added to the sense that Case was trying to manage the problem without fully acknowledging it. In the short term, this saved Case some money. In the long term, it cost them something far more important: trust. Farmers who had stuck with Case for generations now felt abandoned. Every overheated engine, every cracked head, every lost season added another crack to Case's reputation. Not just for the 504 tractors, but for their entire line of equipment. By the time Case finally retired the original 504 engine, the damage was already done. Farmers had started drifting toward John Deere, International Harvester, and even smaller players like White and Allis-Chalmers. Companies that, at least at the time, still had the benefit of the doubt when it came to reliability. While Case engineers tried to patch things behind the scenes, the real fight to save the 504 played out in small-town shops and dealerships across farm country. When a tractor went down, it wasn't Case corporate who answered the phone. It was the local dealer. And as problems with the 504 mounted, those dealers became the last line of defense between angry customers and a brand on the edge of losing its grip. Some dealers rose to the challenge. They knew the 504 wasn't holding up like it should, and they didn't waste time arguing about it. They ordered extra parts, kept rebuild kits in stock, and in some cases, ate the cost of repairs just to keep loyal farmers from walking. One longtime case dealer in Iowa reportedly kept a rebuilt 504 short block on a crate in the back of his shop, knowing full well he'd need it before the season was through. When the call came, his crew could swap a blown engine on a Friday night and have the tractor back in the field by Saturday afternoon. In rural Texas, a different approach took shape. A group of neighboring farmers, all case owners, pooled their resources to buy a set of tools and spare parts that their local dealer couldn't afford to stock. They shared repairs, swapped tips, and leaned on one another when official support ran thin. Their dealer helped where he could, but everyone knew they were mostly on their own. Not every dealer could rise to the occasion. Smaller operations, especially those with tight margins or limited staff, struggled to keep up. When parts were back-ordered or warranty reimbursement was slow, some shops simply couldn't afford to help the way they wanted to. That inconsistency became a problem of its own. In some towns, a farmer's broken 504 was met with empathy and fast repairs. In others, it meant weeks of downtime and a repair bill that felt more like a punishment than a fix. The result was uneven loyalty. Some farmers stayed with Case, not because they trusted the engine, but because their dealer had earned that trust by showing up when it counted. Others walked away, frustrated that the company wasn't standing behind its promises and left without anyone willing to make it right. For the best dealers, that era became a defining chapter. Proof that good service could still mean something even when the product came up short. But for Case as a company, relying on dealers to patch over design flaws was never a winning strategy. Every failure that landed in a shop, instead of being prevented at the factory, chipped away at the brand's foundation. And by the time Case finally phased out the original 504, it was clear. The people who had kept the line going weren't sitting in offices. They were out in the service bays, wrenching late into the night, trying to hold the company's reputation together one engine at a time. Even after Case phased out the original 504, the damage lingered far longer than the engine ever did. Across farm country, Case's reputation had taken a beating. It wasn't just that the 504 had issues, it was the feeling that Case hadn't stood firmly behind its farmers when things went wrong. Word spread in coffee shops, parts counters, and farm auctions. A tractor was no longer just a tractor, it was a gamble. For decades, Case had built its name on simple, rugged reliability. That image had been a powerful part of their identity. But after the 504 experience, some farmers who had been loyal for generations started looking elsewhere. Not because they hated Case, not because they didn't want to believe, but because a season lost to a broken engine could be the difference between making it and falling behind. Sentiment only went so far when the work had to get done. Meanwhile, competitors like John Deere and International Harvester moved aggressively into the vacuum Case left behind. Their machines weren't perfect either, but they hadn't stumbled quite so visibly at such a critical time. Farmers who might have reflexively bought another Case now test drove green or red instead, and some of them never came back. The fallout from the 504 didn't destroy Case overnight. The company pushed on into the late 1970s with new models, new promises, and even better designs. But the damage to trust was real. Every machine after the 70 series had to work twice as hard to win over a skeptical farmer. And when times got tough in the farm economy, that erosion of loyalty made it harder for Case to hold its ground. In time, that slow decline weakened Case's market position, even if it wasn't the deciding factor in what came next. The 1985 merger between Case and International Harvester was driven primarily by the broader collapse in the ag economy. Skyrocketing interest rates, falling land values, and financial pressure that nearly wiped out IH's entire ag division. But the scars left by the 504 years didn't help. When it came time to navigate this crisis, Case was no longer in a position of strength. Today, the 504 isn't remembered with the same bitterness as some other diesel disasters. Enough time has passed that surviving examples are sometimes restored, and the 70 series tractors they powered are recognized for their good qualities as much as their flaws. But for the farmers who lived through it and the dealers who fought to keep the brand's reputation alive, the lessons were written in oil stains, cracked heads, and long nights in the shop. The 504 was supposed to be the engine that saved Case. Instead, it became a hard lesson about what happens when ambition outpaces durability. and when a company underestimates the patience of the people who put their machines to work.